This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So this podcast today is going to be rather different from normal. I decided to take a step sideways and sort of look a little bit at the things that I've been doing and how I've been doing them. And my beginning point was that I about a year and a half, nearly 2 years ago now, I came up with the idea that I wanted to write a companion to Marx's Grundrisse, which is a very, very difficult text. And I set about it and rather systematically began upon it. And then the virus came along. And in a way, this was perfect because, I was on lockdown and I had the Grundrisse and I had my laptop and I could just, spend day after day. So I found myself almost every day doing about 2 or 3 hours work on the Grundrisse, and then I would leave it and do other things. And this went on for, best part of a year and a half until finally it got into shape where I felt I could send it off to the publishers. But this method of doing the work I was thinking about, and I was also beginning to think about backwards. And I suppose the fact that very, very soon I will be 86 years old, and when you get that old, you say, my God, what did I do? How did I do it? What inspired me? What worked and what didn't work? And I was in the middle of writing the Grundrisse, and I started to have more and more thoughts about that. And I suddenly realized that my whole technique of approaching the project of doing a companion to the Grundrisse had its origins back when I was 16 years old. That, in effect, 70 years ago, certain things had happened that led me to start to work in this particular way. And the thing that led me there was essentially something that happened to my father. So I have to introduce you a little bit to who my father was and what he did. He was apprenticed when he was 13 years old into Chatham Dockyard, working on the naval base and naval repair. And he spent most of his life working there, a brief period of unemployment in the 1930s. But and he ascended in the hierarchy there, and he became eventually what you might call a middle management foreman for the work that was being done on the repairing of ships and the refurbishing of ships. But during the Second World War, he became a heavily involved person in ship repair because there was a tremendous demand for it, and the turnaround time had to be very fast. A destroyer would have suffered some sort of bombing damage or flak damage and would need to be repaired and sent back out to sea. So he started to be actually in command of the actually refitting and repair of many of these ships. And he seems to have done a very good job of it because he kept on doing it. And when the war was over, he continued to do it until 1950. And in 1950, when I was 15 years old, he was suddenly told by the Admiralty that he couldn't do the job he had been doing for 7 years because he had not passed the requisite examination. And so he was told that he had to pass this examination, which would be a competitive examination across the whole country in naval construction engineering, in order to continue doing the job that he'd been doing for 7 years. Now, my father left school at 13 years old. He was not highly educated in the formal kind of sense, although he obviously had learned a great deal on the job. But as we all know, learning on the job is rather different from what's in the textbooks. So my father was told he had 2 years to bone up on this examination, and then he had to take the examination. And if he didn't get in the top 10 or 15 or something like that, then he wouldn't have his job. So then what happened was my father came home every work night, and about 5:30 he would come home. We would have a high tea around 6 o'clock, and around 6:30 or 7, my father would go into the front room parlor and he would stay there till 9 o'clock, and then come out at 9 o'clock, listen to the 9 o'clock news. He would always do this every night, and he did it for 2 years, studying his texts. He taught himself calculus, he taught himself all the principles of naval engineering, all this kind of thing. And after 2 years of doing this, he took the examination, and he came in the top 10. So he kept his job. And I subsequently realized how important this was, because if he had not kept his job, he would have lost about a third of his income. And we would have been much, much poorer than we were. Now, I'm on the sidelines watching all of this. And I guess what happened was I sort of internalized the idea that this is how you go about doing something successfully. That is what you've got to do. And ever since then, I've never been frightened of long projects, difficult projects, and I've always approached it almost in the same way. And that was what I was doing with the Grundrisse. 2 or 3 hours every day, maybe not all weekends, but all on weekdays, I would do that. In other words, I was copying him absolutely down to the T in terms of my method of work. Now, the kind of odd thing here is I didn't get on with my father. My father didn't like me for some reason or other. I never felt he approved of me. And I guess there's a funny way in which my whole of my life I've been trying to seek his approval by actually implementing his method. And I think for the first time, I realized this when I was doing the Grundrisse, that my whole method of inquiry was taken on watching my father do that for 2 years and do it and come out of it successfully. And in a sense, that is what I've tried to do all of my academic life. And, it was funny, actually. And I mentioned this in the introduction to the book, the preface to the book. And I said, it's very strange that here I am, 85 years old, acknowledging the influence of my father, but really and truly, it was something that happened to me at that time, which set my ways of thinking about how to do project, and that has been with me ever since. And since then, I don't know, I've published about 25 books or 26 books or something like that, and the Grundrisse will be the 27th. I just keep on going. But that is how I do my work. And I'm often asked, how come I'm so productive? And the answer is, well, I have this method, but my method was entirely copying that of my father. That happened to me so many, many years ago. Now, something else happened to me about that age too, when I was 15 or 16. And I was reading vociferously, and I was very interested in English literature and interested also in geography. And I increasingly was thinking that I would want to study geography if I could, and as I got older, and specialize in geography. And I really liked what was going on in that world. And even at that time, geography to me was not defined as a formal discipline. It was really defined as a way of thinking and a core set of topics. And I later came to define, when somebody said to me, well, what is geography? I would simply say, well, it's the study of the consequences of human engagement with time, space, place, and, for lack of a better word, I say the natural world. In other words, it's about time, space, place, and environment, and human construction of all of those elements, and the consequences that flow from human action across all of those elements. So that, to me, was the core of what geography was about. But it was just kind of a spirit of what the discipline was that was animating me, not sort of some formal kind of statement of what is geography or something of that kind. It was also informed very much by the fact that I used my bicycle to cycle all over the countryside around the area where I lived. I would go over the North Downs, and I would go down into the Weald, into the hop fields, and all kinds of things like that. So I was all over the place, recognizing that there was something there called a geographical landscape, and that the notion of time, space, place, and environment could be sort of tapped into the experience I was having with this. But at the same time as I was doing this, I was also reading literature. And when I was about 16 years old, I came across the poetry of Ts Eliot. Now, T.S. Eliot is a controversial figure, I since found out, but at the time I didn't know anything very much about it. I just saw the poems, started reading the poems, and I thought the poems were marvelous. I thought they were fantastic. And I really started to actually work with the ideas in some of these poems. Now, this is very strange because T.S. Eliot is a very conservative figure. I was not politically very much on the left at the time. He's an Anglo-Catholic, and I was part of the Anglican tradition, even though I didn't really go to church. So he was many of those things, and he was very English, and I guess I was being very English at the time too. So there are many features of that later on I would kind of worry about who Eliot was and what it meant to actually appreciate his poetry. But I just loved the poetry. And I loved it to such a point where I kind of said, well, this actually teaches me so much about the way in which I want to approach the geography that I'm increasingly becoming captive to. And I thought it would be very interesting to read one of my favorite poems to you from the collected poems. It's poems about called Four Quartets, and the first of the four quartets is called Burnt Norton. And the first of these poems is called Burnt Norton, and it's apparently after Elliot having experience in a manor house in Gloucestershire in the west of England, and it's about the experience of being in the garden. And I think what you'll see in this poem are all these themes about time, space, place, and environment are kind of woven into this poetic imaginary that Eliot builds in this poem. And it's a bit of a long poem, so you'll have to bear with me. It'll take me about probably 10 minutes or so to read it. But it goes in this way. Let me read it to you. So this is Burnt Norton. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, round the corner, through the first gate, into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush? Into our first world. There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat, through the vibrant air. And the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye-beam crossed, for the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. They were as our guests, accepted and accepting. So we moved, and they, in formal pattern, along the empty alley into the box circle, to look down into the drained pool. Dry the pool, dry concrete, brown-edged. And the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose quietly, the surface glittered out of a heart of light, and they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. Go, said the bird, for the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly, containing laughter. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. Garlic and sapphires in the mud clot the bedded axle tree. The trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. The dance along the artery, the circulation of the lymph, are figured in the drift of stars. Ascend to summer in the tree, we move above the moving tree, and light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sudden floor, below the boarhound and the boar, pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled among the stars. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards at the still point, there the dance is. But neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered. Neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, and there is only the dance. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light, still and moving, erhebung without motion, concentration without elimination. Both a new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Yet the enchainment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbour where the rain beat, the moment in the draughty church at Smokefall be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered. Here is a place of disaffection. Time before and time after, in a dim light, neither daylight investing form with lucid stillness, turning shadow into transient beauty, with slow rotation suggesting permanence, nor darkness to purify the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temporal, neither plenitude nor vacancy, only a flicker over the strained, time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction. Filled with fancies and empty of meaning, tumid apathy with no concentration, men and bits of paper, whirled by the cold wind that blows before and after time, wind in and out of unwholesome lungs, time before and time after, eructation of unhealthy souls into the faded air, the torpid driven on the wind that sweeps the gloomy hills of London, Hampstead and Clerkenwell, Camden and Putney, Highgate, Primrose and Ludgate. Not here the darkness, in this twittering world. Descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude. World, not world, but that which is not world. Internal darkness, deprivation, and destitution of all property, desiccation of the world of sense, evacuation of the world of fancy, inoperancy of the world of spirit. This is the one way, and the other is the same, not in movement, but abstention from movement, while the world moves in appetency on its metalled ways of time past and time future. Time and the bell have buried the day, the black cloud carries the sun away. Will the sunflower turn to us? Will the clematis stray down, bend to us, tendril and spray, clutch and cling, chill fingers of you be curled down on us? After the kingfisher's wing has answered light to light and is silent, the light is still at the still point of the turning world. Words move, music moves, only in time. But that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into the silence. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness as a Chinese jar still moves perpetually in its stillness. Not the stillness of the violin, while the note lasts. Not that only, but the coexistence. Or say that the end precedes the beginning, and the end and the beginning were always there before the beginning and after the end, and all is always now. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break, under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. Shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering always assail them. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation. The crying shadow in the funeral dance, the loud lament of the disconsolate chimera. The detail of the pattern is movement, as in the figure of the 10 stairs. Desire itself is movement, not in itself desirable. Love is itself unmoving, only the cause and end of movement, timeless and undesiring. Except in the aspect of time, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being, sudden in a shaft of sunlight. Even while the dust moves, there rises the hidden laughter of children in the foliage. Quick now, here, now, always. Ridiculous the waste-sad time, stretching before and after. There are some marvelous figures in this poem, which I go back to a lot. And some of the phraseology is great. The idea that a new world and the old world can be made explicit, understood, and in the completion of its partial ecstasy and the resolution of its partial horror. I just think of that. Elliot was writing this in, I think, 1938, something like that, or maybe a little earlier, when it seemed like the Second World War was coming. And I think the shadow of that, in some ways, is prefigured in this poem. And I think this ephemeral touch where you experience something which just stays with you for such a long time, when he catches it by saying, the moment in the arbour where the rain beat, the moment in the draughty church at Smokefall, how do you remember it? Involved with past and present. And my goodness, are we not in an era where we are distracted from distraction by distraction? And there's a fantastic kind of notion, a definition, if you like, for me, of alienation. When he talks about this world of internal darkness, deprivation, and destitution of all property, desiccation of the world of sense, evacuation of the world of fancy, inoperancy of the world of spirit. That is a fantastic evocation of total alienation, against which there is only one way, which is not to participate. Abstention from the movement is the only answer. And this notion that words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision. My God, it sounds like we're watching Fox News. Nothing will stay still, shrieking voices, scolding, mocking. All of that. And then I think of the world, and I think of, not of World War II, as Elliot had in mind, but I think of environmental degradation, a depleted, desecrated relation to nature, climate change, all of those things. And I think in a few years' time, if we might not actually then use these words, ridiculous, the waste sad time, stretching before and after. In a way, it says that there is room for action. And we have to be brave enough to confront both the partial ecstasy and the partial horror of all that is in front of us. So forgive me for introducing this, but for me this was terribly important because, as I think you can see, these themes of time and temporality, of space, spatiality, and place, the specificities of the rose garden, opening the door to the rose garden. In a funny way, I've always thought of the work I've done on companions to Marx, his Grundrisse and so on, as opening a door, not into a rose garden to be sure, but into something which is, I think, potentially very profound. And that poem has stuck with me. I don't know, all of my life, as a kind of sensibility, a sensitivity that I really appreciate and would want to echo. And I was amazed the other day to learn, and that's partly why I've come back to it too, to learn that of all the poets who are translated into Chinese, the one who is probably the most favored is Ts Eliot. And I think that this is something which is important to communicate and bring into the way in which we try to interpret the world. And it's something which I've occasionally tried to do, not very successfully, but it's always with me. That is what I would want to do. That is what I would want my audience to appreciate. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.